Hey guys, Ange here to break down UFC 306, Sean O'Malley versus MERAB DVALISHVILI for the bantamweight title. This is at the Sphere, which I couldn't really care about too much if I'm being honest, but I'm really excited about this matchup. I think it's been a long time coming and there's a lot of intrigue. At the end of the day, I think there's a pretty clear-cut favourite that I'm choosing. I think this card is really cool, but I feel like it's still lacking a bit of star power in my opinion. The co-main and main event are really good, and so is the featured bout, but because it's such a significant event, I would have liked to see a few more names, like even Brandon Moreno would have been a really good one, because he's Mexican and he's such a big star, and even Tony Ferguson could have fought on this card, but whatever, everyone's going to watch it anyway, but it would have felt a bit more epic if they had a few more names in there. But that's just what I feel. On the other hand, it is nice seeing some up-and-coming Mexican fighters, but a few of the fighters have got on haven't really been in the UFC very long, so it's very interesting that they're on the main card. I think there's a couple of them that have only had one or two fights in the UFC. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. First bout of the main card, we have Ronaldo Rodriguez versus Osbourne. He's been in the UFC a while now. He's had a few ups and downs. He kind of wins a couple, loses a couple. So they've matched up Rodriguez. They've matched him up with someone he can beat. Also, Ode's lost a couple of fights by submission, which is how Rodriguez wins a lot of his fights. This is his second fight in the UFC. He's on a 6-fight win streak. He did try and get into the UFC about 6 fights ago, but he lost on Contender Series. So he does have history with the UFC. He's only 25, so there is a lot of potential there. This fight, could have a few surprises for him just because it is his second fight in the UFC. But if he sticks to a really smart game plan, he'll be able to submit Ode, I reckon. Ode can be dangerous, though. He can catch you if you're being sloppy. But I'm still going to favour Rodriguez in this fight. I think he's a clear favourite. Still young, still a little bit unproven, but I think that he will be able to get this sub. So I'm going Rodriguez by submission, possibly in the first round. Second fight of the main card, we have Daniel ZELLHUBER versus Esteban RIBOVICS. So Daniel is another Mexican. He's a clear favourite, another young prospect, 15-1, only 25. He's very tall for the lightweight division, 6-1. He's got the reach advantage and the leg reach advantage, so he's very long and lanky. And against Esteban RIBOVICS, he has, done pretty well in the UFC himself. He's got a KO over Terence McKinney, but McKinney can be very susceptible to the KOs. And he's got a unanimous decision against someone called Camelia Kirk and a unanimous decision loss against someone else I don't really know. Esteban, though, he's 13-1, so he's a real prospect too. So this fight's maybe a little bit more competitive in my opinion. I think that there's more of a chance that RIBOVICS can get him. So, yeah, I'm not really sure what's happening with the odds here. ZELLHUBER, he's on a 3-fight win streak, and he does win most of his fights by unanimous decision. Well, out of his last 3, 2 are unanimous decision, and 1 is a submission. I think this fight could probably go either way. I think 6-1 is very tall for a lightweight fighter, although he is young enough probably to get away with it. I think the odds should be more even on this fight. I think that if you're betting, maybe go with RIBOVICS. I reckon he could get in there and get a KO, just looking at the records. Unless ZELLHUBER is really dangerous with the submission, but the fact that he's got 2 unanimous decision losses tells me that he's probably not really that much of a finisher. Although, that's what RIBOVICS has got, 2 unanimous decisions. Look, this fight is a coin flip, but if you're going to bet on it, go with the dog, I say. Because they've both only had 1 loss each, so it's really not enough information to go on. Yeah, I'm going Esteban RIBOVICS for the upset by KO. Maybe second round? The featured bout, we get the matchup again with Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes. I'm glad this fight didn't happen actually a few months back, just because Ortega looked so miserable on the scale. He would have not shown up. So he's a very clever guy not to fight. Whether or not that was his decision, I don't know. Diego Lopes, he's a gun. He fought Dan Ige. That was a tough fight for him. Maybe that was mainly because Dan Ige was a last-minute replacement and he couldn't game plan for him very well. But that was a very close fight, and you probably would have liked to see a prospect like Lopes finish him. But that's nothing against him because that was a really strange circumstance. I think Dan Ige took that fight on 8 hours notice or something ridiculous. So let's look at Ortega. He's the underdog. He's had a few wars in the UFC. He's been fighting up, at elite level for a very long time, but he's taken a lot of damage and he's had a lot of injuries. He's had 2 attempts at the belt and they've both ended up in brutal, bloody wars where he's taken so much damage. And he's had, that shoulder injury that caused that first loss to Yair Rodriguez, but he got that back in really impressive fashion. I think Ortega is one of the toughest fighters I've ever seen in the UFC, and that's something very dangerous because he can take so much damage and still come back. He is such a zombie. That's going to be a real big test for Diego because I think Diego can gas out a little bit perhaps, but I think this fight is 3 rounds, and I think that's probably going to be a really good help for Diego because if this fight was 5 rounds, I would have Ortega winning. But because it's 3, it's a little bit more difficult to predict. Ortega has lost 2 out of his last 3 fights, though. That was the title fight to Alexander Volkanovski, and that was the injury to Yair Rodriguez, but he did get it back. In getting it back, though, he had to go through fire to get to Yair because Yair can fade after the first couple of rounds, and that's kind of what happened, and he got the better of him. Interestingly enough, Diego Lopes has had a lot more fights than Ortega. They haven't been on the same level. He's had an interesting career, actually. Diego Lopes is on a 4-fight win streak, and he's had a lot of fights. He's 25-6. That's a lot for an upcoming prospect to have. He is still only 29, but he's been there. He's been around the traps. So he had a few setbacks. He tried out for Contender Series a few years ago, and he lost, I think. Yeah, and he couldn't finish Dan Ige. That's what I've written here. So there's a few questions around Diego. He's looked so good in the UFC, though. He's had really tough fights, like that first fight against Movsar Evloev, which was extremely close. He lost it, but that was his last-minute debut in the UFC, and he looked absolutely amazing. He's been on a tear since then, KO'd Pat Sabatini, TKO'd Sadiq Youssef in amazing fashion, and then he had that last-minute replacement fight with Dan Ige where he looked like he was tested. But having said that, it's shown that he can weather the storm a bit. But I think against Brian Ortega, it's going to be another level of weathering the storm. It's going to be the elite level of weathering the storm. So this is going to be a big test. I think the odds are counting out Ortega a little bit. Sure, he's had a lot of injuries and he's getting older, but then when you look at the records, Lopes has had 30 fights and Ortega has had about 20 fights. Different levels though, different levels. But you kind of wonder what kind of wear and tear has Lopes taken in these fights we haven't really seen in different promotions. There's a few questions there as well. I'm not counting out Ortega in this fight at all. I think the odds should be a little bit more even, maybe favor Lopes a little bit, maybe a slight favorite just because he's younger. I don't know, maybe it's a bias. I think, Ortega's just had too many injuries, and I know how bad shoulder injuries are. I've listened to Luke Thomas talk about them. I feel like people are counting out Ortega a bit. I wouldn't be surprised to see Ortega win. I think this is actually more of a coin flip fight, slight edge on Lopes. But if I had to pick, I'm actually going to pick Ortega for the upset. I think that he could grind it out and maybe even finish Lopes in the 3rd round. I don't think Lopes can submit Ortega. It's a bit of a crazy pick, but I'll pick Ortega 3rd round TKO. It's risky though. That's the fun of it. Okay, co-main event. Alexa won the title of Valentina, who's been a long-reigning champion, one of the greatest female fighters of all time. Quite impressively, she took advantage of that spinning back kick or spin that Valentina was doing, and she took her back and submitted her. And she ended her 9-fight win streak. The rematch was interesting because I thought Valentina won that fight 3-2, but it was scored as a split draw, which means that Grasso kept the belt. So that was a little bit annoying. I felt like the judges were biased. Doesn't matter now, it's in the past, but I do feel like Valentina was kind of robbed there, which is a bit of a shame because I'm not all that interested to see this fight just because I'm not really emotionally invested in either of these fighters. Valentina's really cool and I respect her, but I think the flyweight division as a whole is kind of lacking a bit, just for me as a fan. This is just a personal opinion. It's good, but I feel like there's not enough excitement in the flyweight division. It's exciting, I think, if you're a Mexican. This is really big. Alexa, she's a really good fighter. She's a great boxer. She fights well to a game plan. It's exciting. And I know a lot of people love Valentina, but for me personally, I kind of wish it was a different fight. I kind of wish that Valentina won the belt back and retired and went up to bantamweight, did something fun, or that we'll see a different matchup like Alexa fighting the next up-and-comer like Madame Furore or someone. Because I hate these title fights that go over 3, like a trilogy. It's just, sometimes it just doesn't need to happen. Like, did Alexander Volkanovski really have to fight Max 3 times? And Moreno and Figueiredo fighting for 3 times. It's just boring after a while. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. But having said that, I know this fight's really important to a lot of people, including these 2 women. So let's get into it. The odds are even, which is interesting. They're respecting both women, and I think that's probably fair. Alexa Grasso is 31. She's 16-3. She's had 1 title defense now, even though it was a draw, which is a little bit weak in my opinion, especially because a lot of people believe Valentina won that fight. But regardless, she's still a champ. Before she fought for the belt, she beat Viviane Araújo, which isn't really much of a name if you ask me. But Alexa is very skilled at boxing, and she does stick to a game plan. And she's been working with some really great fighters like Brandon Moreno, which is a little bit sneaky because Moreno helped Valentina, so he would have given her a lot of information on how to beat Valentina, which is a bit dirty, but I guess there's no rules, right? Grasso has a brown belt in BJJ. She's not the best high-level grappler, but she was still able to use it efficiently. I guess belts don't really matter in MMA anyway. Physically, both these women are very equal in height, reach, leg reach. They've got very similar stats. So Valentina went to a draw with Alexa Grasso in the last fight, which I thought she won. Before that, she got submitted by Alexa Grasso. And before that, she did have a split decision with Talia Santos. And that was actually a very close fight in itself. A couple of people thought that Talia Santos won that fight. And you could see that Valentina was starting to slow down just a fraction because she's usually very, very dominant, very, very switched on. And you can see that in her last few fights, she was starting to slow down a bit until she lost the belt because she was being a little careless. It's hard to always be improving when you're on the top for so long. So I think once she lost, she came back and looked way better in the rematch. Still a very close fight, but I do think she won. And now I think she's going to be even more determined. But I guess the only thing really going against her now is that she's 36 and she's been around a while. She's had a lot more fights compared to Grasso. She's had about 27 fights. She's a true legend and she was on top for so long. You kind of wonder what kind of fatigue that gives you. Valentina is one of the best fighters of all time. We never really got to see her rematch Nunes, which is a bit of a shame because I think that perhaps she was just as good, if not better than Amanda Nunes, but the size advantage was on Nunes. So people are like, oh, Amanda's better, but no, she's just bigger than Valentina. Valentina's most likely at the end of her prime. She's deadly focused when she wants to be, but yeah, in a couple of those fights before losing, she did seem to be a bit careless. So this is a hard fight to pick. I think Grasso does have that advantage because she's got to prove herself. And if she doesn't win this, then it will seem like it was just a fluke to beat Valentina. She's really got to win this fight. And for Valentina, she's probably very fueled to once and for all put a stamp on the fact that Grasso should have never beat her and that she did win the last fight. So they're both going to be highly motivated coming into this fight. I think the advantage, though, is on Grasso's side just because she's younger. She probably has a little bit more to prove. Valentina's out of her prime now. And even though I think Valentina is perhaps a better martial artist all round, she's also more old school now. And Grasso is very clever with little things that she implements. So I'm going to pick Grasso here by unanimous decision. I think we're going to get a really competitive fight, but I just don't expect Valentina. I think she's going to try, but it's just hard to keep up with the young fighters. So that's what I'm thinking. But it could go either way, this fight. Sugar Sean O'Malley versus MERAB DVALISHVILI for the bantamweight title. This fight has been much anticipated. I think probably one of the more anticipated fights. After doing my research, I'm actually way more excited than even Dricus versus Izzy, because I felt like Izzy wasn't the legit number one contender. It didn't sit right with me, but this fight has been much anticipated. Merab's on his 10-fight win streak, and O'Malley is doing amazing things. Who would have thought that O'Malley could have actually got the belt? Because there was so much hype on O'Malley, but then he wasn't quite convincing people. But then he showed up and he kept learning, kept his head down, and he's become a really, really confident champion that's going to be very hard to beat. So this is a really interesting fight. There's a lot of stats on each side, but overall, they all kind of point to one guy, in my opinion, who's going to come out as the winner. The odds are very even. They're still favouring O'Malley, but not by much. It's pretty much a pick-em fight, which I find a little interesting. Yeah, so Sugar Sean O'Malley is an interesting guy. Sometimes it feels like he's been kind of forced down our throats a bit with the advertising, but I think that's just because he probably really relates to maybe a younger audience, like teenage boys even, or not even teenage boys, but younger guys. I don't really know if he has any female fans. He probably does, but he's a very sort of, I think O'Malley's more of a niche kind of star compared to Conor. I think Conor reached out to a lot of people, but O'Malley's big, but he doesn't have that same, he's not on that same level as Conor, even though he says he will be. I'll be very surprised. Having said that though, he has his own niche. He has very, very devoted fans. Maybe even more than, say, Conor, because Conor was more of an overall figure. But I think O'Malley has that dedicated fan base that's very powerful. But it kind of felt like there was a lot of talk and hype, and he was favoured on the way to the title, and it kind of made you want to see him lose. But he's proven that he's worked on his skills in the meantime and really evolved as a fighter. And he's very clever and elusive, apparently very different to how he appears on camera. And he's got his friend Timbo, and they're a very powerful duo. They've achieved a lot of things together. O'Malley's just so clever because he's like, oh, look at this, look at this, look at this. And he goes, poof. And he's like that with his persona, and he's like that with his fighting. So he is a very compelling fighter, whether you love or hate him. He's an interesting guy because sometimes I can't tell whether I want to root for him or not, whether I love him or hate him, or I'm just not sure about him because he's kind of elusive. Like everything he says, I think he has a lot of intention behind, even though it may not seem like it's thought out. I think he thinks out everything he says with a lot of intention just to confuse you. He's a very clever person. Love or hate him, you have to admire O'Malley. He is definitely one of a kind. Okay, let's look at some of O'Malley's stats. I've written down a lot here. So O'Malley's only 29 still. He's 18-1 at bantamweight, which is incredible, even though he cherry-picked on the way to the belt. Still, he didn't lose. He only lost to Vero, and he got that fight back. He's 5'11", so quite tall for bantamweight, but he's very lanky anyway, so I don't think that he's cutting too much weight to make bantamweight. He's got a long reach, and he does well against short fighters like MERAB in general. O'Malley's coming into his prime. He's on a 6-fight win streak, excluding his no contest. He's constantly getting better and improving and just showing new things each fight. Another thing about O'Malley is that he's very present. He has an extreme laser focus, and his mental confidence. He's just got everything in place mentally. He has that confidence and that aura of a really great champion or a great star. He's sly and deceiving. He's a dangerous counter striker. I've also written, although I've already touched on this, he generally does really well against short and stocky fighters, and that fighters that are really aggressive that come towards you like MERAB. His counter wrestling has improved greatly. He was able to get out of quite a few of those wrestling exchanges that Aljo threw on him. So he did really well against Aljo, I think, in the wrestling. And you never really see the true O'Malley until it's too late. That's the scary thing about O'Malley, is that you don't know what he's thinking. He can coordinate himself so well in a fight. You're always a few steps behind him. And I think he's kind of displayed that in every single fight I've seen, even in the one he lost against Vera. The only thing that hurt him there was the perennial nerve, and that is a bit of a fluke. It's still fair, but it was an unusual kick. And I think that's probably your best bet if you want to beat O'Malley. Some sort of freak injury or some sort of fluke is how you're going to beat him, because he is so technical and so clever that there's no way you can beat him in the technical game. Having said that though, if you come to him recklessly, like MERAB probably will, he can still catch you and counter you quite easily, because he would have gone through every single combination that MERAB throws. MERAB is going to have to really, really change up his style, I think, to win this fight. O'Malley just beat Marlon Vera, and he beat the hell out of him March 24. Everyone kind of expected that though, but it was still pretty amazing how well he fought. His foot movement in particular, the foot movement of O'Malley has really improved. He TKO'd Aljamain Sterling, composed himself so well. And before that, it was a close decision with Piotr Jan, and maybe Petr Yan would have won that fight if it wasn't based on visible damage. But that was O'Malley's first major step up in competition. I think that since then he's just kept improving. I'm pretty high on O'Malley, as you can probably tell. I'm not a fan, but I understand how incredible he is as a fighter and a person when it comes to mentality and fighting. Okay, let's look at MERAB. MERAB has been on a tear ever since he got into the UFC. I don't think he's lost in the UFC. Maybe he has, but I didn't write down who he lost to. But he hasn't lost in 10 fights. He's 33. He's 17-4. So he's 5'6", and his reach is 6'8". So he's shorter and stockier. That may be an advantage or it may not be, but when you look at O'Malley and the matchup, the shorter fighters never do well against him. Let's just look at what I've written here. So he's a cardio king. He's probably got the best cardio in the UFC. That's his main strength. He wins a ton by unanimous decision, so he's not really finishing a lot of people. Sometimes he does finish people. Oh, his last few wins he hasn't anyway. He doesn't really have that punching power, and that's probably a problem because even if he's able to take a few shots to get to O'Malley, he's probably not going to cause a lot of damage. He's a savage, forward pace, and he's a wrestler striker. He's a bit of a dog, so he's game. Some people, like if you're too afraid of O'Malley, that's just as bad, but he's going to have to come forward to O'Malley with his own new flavor. A big question I have about MERAB is that I'm not sure whether he's in his prime or leaving his prime, because I feel like he looked a bit fresher maybe a few fights ago, and I feel like he's probably waited potentially a bit too long to fight for the belt. Maybe he should have fought against Ange sooner and betrayed their friendship if he really wanted the best chance. I feel like now he's kind of scrapped around for too long, and I'll get more into that in a second. Although he hasn't lost a fight in 6 years on his 10-fight win streak. I've also written, he's going to need a surprising game plan to throw off O'Malley. O'Malley and his team, they have a lot of insight into the way that, I guess, Ray Longo does stuff. Unless MERAB's training elsewhere, I think they know what to expect. I think Ange would have been a really good warm-up for them, just because MERAB, even though he fights very differently, I think that his style is going to favour O'Malley a bit more. And he's probably going to have the same tendencies. And unless MERAB, so let me just say it clearly, unless MERAB really changes his tactics completely, in a completely different way that what they could anticipate, I think he's going to have a lot of trouble because I think that O'Malley's going to be able to predict what he's going to do. And as long as O'Malley can predict what he's going to do, it's going to be an early night, I think, for MERAB. O'Malley's foot movement is, he can just get out of the way and counter you on the fly. And I just see him getting knocked out unless he comes with some sort of really interesting, unorthodox way of approaching O'Malley. I just don't think he'll be able to catch him. But let me just say what else I've written here. Another thing about MERAB not fighting Ange is that I think it kind of shows that he's not as dedicated as what we would have hoped. And I know this sounds really kind of negative in a way, but I think a fighter needs to be really selfish and put themselves first, especially if they want to become champion. You have to be selfish and you have to put yourself before your friendships if you really want to go for it. And, he could prove me wrong and that'll teach me a lesson, but I just think that you've really got to, you can't take these shots for granted. Maybe this will serve him well. Maybe he can be like Dricus did and be like, no, I'm not going to fight you, for the title yet. It's not the right timing. And maybe he will get it, but I just think it's it shows a bit of his character. He sounds like a lovely guy, but also some of the other stuff he's done, he's a bit of a joker. And I'm not saying he's not serious about fighting. Of course he is. I mean, he wouldn't have reached this level if he wasn't, but I kind of feel like he's not invested enough in himself. If you look at O'Malley, he's invested in himself 100%. He's invested. He knows that being selfish is going to help himself, but it's also going to help others. And I think once a champion realizes that, that's how they become powerful. Being selfish is going to actually help me be less selfish. But MERAB, he doesn't see that way. He sees it more like, no, I've got to be a friend first and then I'll come later. But if you put yourself later, then that may not work out for you. So I'm being very critical about this. I also think MERAB's done some things characteristically. He seems to want to please others, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just think that he's mentally, he's not quite in the right place. If you compare it to O'Malley, O'Malley is not going to give you a chance. O'Malley is 100% locked in, and he is not going to just fuck around. Everything he does has meaning to it. That's what I'm trying to say. MERAB just seems to just go in there and fight like a dog. And if he does that, he's not going to beat O'Malley. But if he tries to fight O'Malley with a precise game plan, maybe that won't suit him either, because maybe he won't be MERAB anymore. Now let's look at his fights. Henry Cejudo this February, unanimous decision. Piotr Jan was March last year by unanimous decision. And the year before that, Jose Aldo by unanimous decision. He's fighting once a year. That's really, really not enough. Kind of makes me wonder whether he's had injuries, whether he's getting older in his career. Although hasn't had too many fights, but I just get the feeling that MERAB's had a lot of wear and tear, the way he fights. He's reckless. Probably the kind of fighter that overtrains. He's had a couple of weird fights too. The one against Jose Aldo, I think in that fight, Jose didn't show up at all, and MERAB just had an easy fight. Similar with Henry Cejudo, I think that was kind of an easy fight for MERAB as well. I don't think Henry showed up, and the size advantage was a struggle for Henry there, because Henry is not big enough for bantamweight. Yeah, fights once a year. I don't mean to talk down MERAB, but I'm just saying there's a lot of red flags on his side, and it all just leads to O'Malley knocking him out in the first round. I'm picking O'Malley to win in the first round by finish. I think O'Malley is just supremely ahead of MERAB in a lot of areas, and I think there's just so much going against MERAB. It's going to take all the stars to align for him to get to beat O'Malley. That's how I see it. I could be completely wrong. I'm just going on my instinct and all this information I've gathered, but I just feel like MERAB's fucked around too much, and you just can't fuck around when you fight someone like O'Malley. O'Malley is a really dangerous fighter. So yeah, I've got O'Malley by KO in the first round. But yeah, thanks for coming by, and thanks for your support and commenting. Thanks to everyone who came to the live stream. That was my first time, so that was fun. Really cool to talk to people all around the world. So for this fight, I'm not actually going to be able to watch it live. So my reaction video or recap could be a bit later in the week, but I'll see how I go. Anyway, enjoy the fights and enjoy the Sphere experience. Maybe it'll be really cool. Enjoy your week and see you around the traps. Bye.